Sometimes, the loneliest people are the ones everyone has decided are not worth knowing. For 12 years, that was Nelson Rock, a man living on the fringes of a small frontier town nestled at the edge of the Rocky Mountains. The Mountain Man, they called him. He lived alone beyond the pines, coming into town only for supplies. People would cross the street when he approached. Mothers would whisper warnings to their children. He was the man no one spoke to, the shadow everyone avoided. Then a 6-year-old orphan named Nora arrived. She had tangled red hair and knew nothing of the town's stories about him. She only saw a quiet man who carved animals from wood and never raised his voice. What happens when a child sees beyond what the adults refuse to? Before we return to our story, we'd love to know where you're watching from. And if this tale moves you, be sure to subscribe, because we have something very special in store for you tomorrow. Winter had settled over Pine Ridge like a held breath, the kind of cold that ached in the bones and shuttered the heart. The town lay in a valley where the Rockies rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks veiled by low-hanging clouds that promised more snow. It was December of 1883, and the frontier settlement had seen 23 winters since its founding, each one leaving its mark on the weathered buildings and the faces of those who called this place home. The main street cut through the heart of town, lined with false-fronted buildings that tried to look grander than they were. There was Pritchard's General Store, the Silver Pine Saloon, the blacksmith's forge that cast sparks into the twilight, and the church with its white steeple, rising at the far end like a moral compass pointing to the heavens. Between these establishments, smaller shops and homes huddled together as if for warmth. But on the edge of town, where the pines grew dense and the mountain slope began its steep ascent, stood a cabin that might as well have been in another territory. It was a solid structure, built with care years ago, with a stone chimney that breathed a thin ribbon of smoke each evening. The windows would glow with firelight after dark, but no one ever drew near. No one ever knocked. Nelson Rock had lived there for 12 years, and in all that time he had perhaps exchanged 1,000 words with the townsfolk. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, the kind who cut his own firewood and hauled his own water. His beard was now shot through with gray, though he was no older than 40. His hands were scarred and calloused, knuckles ridged, fingers thick. He moved with the economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion was wasted energy, and out here, energy was survival. Every couple of weeks, he would come down from his cabin with pelts to trade or gold dust he'd panned from the creek that ran behind his property. He'd enter Pritchard's store just after dawn, before most people were stirring. George Pritchard would nod once, Nelson would nod back, and they would conduct their business in near silence. Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, tobacco. The transaction was always the same. Nelson would pay in coin or trade, take his goods, and leave. George Pritchard was perhaps the only man in Pine Ridge who remembered the Nelson from before. Before the silence. Before the cabin on the edge of town became a place people spoke of in whispers. George remembered a younger man with an easier smile. A man who had come to Pine Ridge with a wife whose laughter could brighten the grayest day, and a little girl with dark curls who held her father's hand as they walked through town. That was 12 years ago, before the fire. No one spoke of it directly anymore, but everyone knew. Nelson had gone up into the mountains to check his trap lines, planning to be gone for 3 days. A chimney fire had started in the night. It happened in winter, happened too often, and by the time the neighbors saw the flames, it was too late. Catherine Rock and 5-year-old Lily had died in the blaze. They found Nelson 2 days later when he returned, standing in the ashes of what had been his home, his family, his entire world. At first, the town had tried. They brought food, offered a place to stay, spoke words of comfort. But Nelson built that cabin on the outskirts with his own 2 hands. He moved in alone and closed the door on everyone. Grief did strange things to people, the old-timers said. Give him time. But time passed. 12 long years, and Nelson Rock remained as distant as the cloud-shrouded mountain peaks. The town eventually stopped trying. Then, because people need stories to make sense of things they don't understand, they began to tell different ones. How Nelson had always been strange, how he'd been negligent, leaving his family alone like that. How there was something dangerous in his eyes now, something wild. Mothers pulled their children close when he passed. Men turned away, avoiding his gaze. The silence around Nelson Rock grew heavier with each passing year, until it was a wall no one thought to breach. Inside his cabin, Nelson lived a life of routine. He rose before dawn, built up the fire, and made coffee strong enough to peel paint. He checked his traps in winter, panned for gold in summer, and hunted when he needed meat. He kept his cabin clean, his tools sharp, and his woodpile stacked neat and high against the coming cold. At night, he would sit by the fire and carve. The carving had started as something to occupy his hands during the long winter nights. He had found his father's old whittling knife in a box of saved belongings, its handle worn smooth from years of use. The initials J.R. carved into the base. James Rock, a man who had taught his son that a sharp knife and a good piece of wood could make something beautiful, if you had the patience. Nelson had long since forgotten about beauty, but his hands remembered the motions. Slowly, animals began to emerge from blocks of pine and cedar. A bear, a moose, an eagle with its wings spread wide. He never showed them to anyone. They stood in a line on the mantel above his hearth, a silent congregation, keeping watch over his solitude. On this particular December morning, as Nelson headed to Pritchard's with a bundle of beaver pelts, the town was buzzing with news. A child had arrived on yesterday's stagecoach, an orphan from the East sent to live with her only living relative, Pauline Mercer, a stern-faced woman who ran the boarding house. A niece she had never met was now her responsibility. Nelson overheard the whispers as he did his business with George Pritchard. The shopkeeper's wife, Dorothy, stood by the stove with 2 other women, their voices carrying in the quiet store. "Poor little thing," Dorothy was saying. "They say she lost both parents to the typhoid fever. Only 6 years old and already seen such tragedy. Pauline's not exactly the motherly type." "That child will have a hard road ahead of her," another woman added, her tone suggesting it was an understatement. "Still, family is family. It's better than an orphanage back east." Nelson gathered his supplies and headed for the door, but Dorothy's next words made him pause. "Did you see her hair? Red as autumn leaves. And those eyes, so curious about everything. She kept asking questions about the mountains, about the animals." The door swung shut behind Nelson, cutting off the rest. He stood for a moment on the wooden boardwalk, his breath clouding in the cold air. A child, a little girl. For an instant, he felt something twist inside his chest, something he had thought long dead. He shook it off and headed back to his cabin, the snow crunching under his boots. 3 days passed before Nelson saw the girl. He was in town again, this time selling a deer he had brought down. As he stepped out of the butcher's shop, counting his coins, he noticed a commotion near the church. A small figure in a too large coat was darting across the street, laughing as she chased after a scruffy dog. Behind her, Pauline Mercer's sharp voice cried out, "Nora! Nora, you get back here this instant! That animal is filthy!" But the girl, Nora, was lost in the joy of the moment. The dog, a stray that roamed the town, was clearly enjoying the game, its tail wagging as it dodged and weaved. Nora's laughter rang out, clear and bright in the cold air, and for a moment, Nelson was frozen to the spot. It was a sound so alive, so full of joy, despite all the child had lost. Her red hair had escaped from under her cap and flew wild about her face. She couldn't catch the dog, but it didn't seem to matter. The chase itself was the prize. Then her eyes found Nelson. She stopped running, the dog forgotten, and simply stared at him with open curiosity. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look away. She just looked. Her head tilted slightly, as if he were a puzzle she was trying to solve. Pauline caught up to her, grabbing her arm. "I told you to stay close," she said sharply. Then she noticed where Nora was looking, and her expression hardened. She pulled the child closer, turned her around, and marched her back toward the boarding house. But not before Nora glanced back over her shoulder at Nelson, her eyes still curious, still questioning. That night, Nelson sat by his fire longer than usual. He had a fresh piece of cedar in his hands, his knife resting beside it, but he couldn't bring himself to start cutting. Instead, he found himself staring into the flames, remembering things he had spent 12 years trying to forget. Lily's laughter, the way Catherine used to hum as she cooked, the weight of his daughter on his shoulders as he carried her through town. The guilt rose as it always did, threatening to suffocate him. He should have been there, should have checked the chimney one more time before he left. Should have. But beneath the guilt, something else was stirring, something he couldn't name. That little girl's eyes, so open and unafraid. That laugh, so full of life. He shook his head and set the wood aside. Some things were best left alone. Some doors, once closed, were meant to stay that way. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. Inside his cabin, surrounded by the wooden animals he had carved, Nelson Rock sat alone with his memories and his guilt, unaware that everything was about to change. That the innocence and stubborn heart of one small child were about to do what 12 years of isolation could not. On the shelf beside his carved animals sat a worn leather journal, one he hadn't opened in years, filled with pressed flowers Catherine had loved, and letters he'd started to write to Lily after she was gone. Letters he could never bring himself to finish. Within its pages were the remains of a man who once knew how to love, how to hope, how to live. That man was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of pain and guilt and silence. He just needed someone brave enough to look. The days that followed the first encounter passed slowly for Nora. Life with Aunt Pauline was nothing like the warm, chaotic home she remembered from before the sickness took her parents. The boarding house was clean and orderly. Every surface scrubbed, every corner tidy, but it felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. Aunt Pauline wasn't precisely cruel. She provided meals, a warm bed, proper clothes, but there was no softness in her, no give. She dealt in instructions and corrections. Sit up straight, Nora. Eat your vegetables. Children should be seen and not heard. Don't you track snow into my clean house. Nora tried to be good. She really did. But 6 is too young to be still for long. Too young to hold back the questions that were always bubbling up. too young to understand why laughter seemed to annoy her aunt so much. On the fifth day after her arrival, Nora asked if she could go outside to play. Play? Aunt Pauline looked up from her mending with a frown. It's nearly time for supper. And play where, exactly? Out in that snow? I could build a snowman. You'll catch your death of cold, and then I'll be the one to nurse you. The answer is no. But I'll wear my coat and my mittens. I said no, Nora. Now set the table. The boarders will be down soon. Nora set the table in silence, placing each fork and knife exactly where Aunt Pauline had shown her. But inside something was growing, a restlessness, a longing for open spaces and freedom. She had been cooped up in the house for days, and the mountains, visible from her window, beckoned to something in her spirit. That night, after the boarders had eaten, and Aunt Pauline had retired to her room with her Bible, Nora lay in her small bed under the eaves and made a decision. Tomorrow, while her aunt was busy with morning chores, Nora would slip out for just a moment, just to see what lay beyond the town's edge. Her chance came the following afternoon. With Pauline in the cellar taking inventory of the preserves, Nora pulled on her coat, her red mittens, and her scarf, and quietly opened the back door. The cold air hit her face like a splash of water, bracing and wonderful. She was free. At first, she walked quickly, but she broke into a run as soon as she was past the last of the town's buildings. The snow was deeper here, untouched by wagon wheels or boots. It came up to her knees, making each step an effort. But she didn't care. She followed a line of tracks. Rabbit, she thought, remembering the pictures from her book as they led toward the trees. The pines rose before her, dark and mysterious. Snow clung to their boughs, and the air smelled different here, cleaner, somehow wilder. Nora pushed deeper into the trees, her breath puffing out in quick white clouds. She lost track of how long she had been walking. Time felt different in the forest, measured by the crunch of snow and the occasional call of a bird. She was following another set of tracks now, larger ones, a deer perhaps, when she suddenly emerged into a small clearing. And there, about 50 yards ahead, stood a cabin. It was solid and well built, with smoke curling from its chimney. A great pile of firewood was stacked against one wall, covered by a tarp. An axe was embedded in a chopping block. And beside that block, his arms full of logs, was the man from town, the one everyone avoided, the one with the sad eyes. Nora should have been afraid. She had overheard the whispered conversations among the women at the boarding house, enough to know this man was someone to be steered clear of. But standing there, half hidden behind the thick trunk of a pine, she felt no fear. She felt curiosity. The man, whose name she did not yet know, moved with a careful economy, stacking the wood with precision against the cabin wall. He was large. She could see that in his broad shoulders and big hands. But his movements weren't rough or angry. They were deliberate, almost gentle, as if he were performing an important ritual. She must have made a sound, a twig snapping under her boot, or a sharp intake of breath, because he suddenly went still. His head turned slowly toward her, and their eyes met across the clearing. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Nora felt her heart beat quickly, but not with fear. With something else. Excitement, maybe, or a kind of recognition, though she couldn't have said of what. Nelson, because of course it was Nelson, stared at the small intruder in his sanctuary. The red-haired child from town, the one with the curious eyes. She looked so small, standing there in the snow, her coat a little too big, one mitten a brighter red than the other. She shouldn't be here. This was his place, his refuge from the world and its judgments. "Are you lost?" he said at last, his voice rusty from disuse. It came out harsher than he'd intended. Nora shook her head. "No, sir. I was following tracks. Tracks don't lead anywhere good in these woods. You need to go back to town. Are those carvings yours?" She pointed toward the window, where three wooden animals sat on the sill: a rabbit, a fox, and a bird. Nelson blinked, surprised by the abrupt change of subject. "Yes, they're beautiful. You made them?" "I did. Now you need to. Can you teach me?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Nelson felt something tighten in his chest. This child, this tiny person who should know better than to wander in the woods, who should know better than to talk to him, was asking him to teach her something. She was looking at him as if he had something worth learning. "No," he said more sharply than was necessary. "Go home. Now, before your family starts to worry." Nora's face fell, but she nodded. She turned to go, then looked back over her shoulder. "What's your name?" He shouldn't answer. He shouldn't encourage this. But something in her earnest expression made him speak. "Nelson." "I'm Nora. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Nelson." And then she was gone, trudging back through the snow the way she had come, leaving a trail of small footprints behind her. Nelson stood in the clearing for a long time after she had disappeared into the trees. His arms were still full of firewood, but he'd forgotten about it. A child had come to his cabin, had spoken to him, had asked him to teach her something. He shook his head and went inside, dropping the logs by the hearth with more force than usual. This was exactly what he didn't need. Complications, connections, a curious child who didn't know enough to be afraid. But as he sat by the fire that night, he found his hands reaching for a piece of wood and his whittling knife. Without consciously deciding to, he began to carve. His hands moved with practiced skill, and slowly a shape emerged. Small ears, a bushy tail, bright eyes. A fox, small enough to fit in a child's hand. He finished it as the fire was burning down to embers and sat looking at it in his palm. What was he doing? He couldn't encourage the girl. He couldn't let her think they could be friends. He was a man who brought misfortune to everyone around him. A man who had failed to protect the people he loved most. He should throw the carving in the fire. Should ensure the girl never came back. Instead, he placed it carefully on the shelf with the others and went to bed, his head filled with an image of red hair, curious eyes, and a question he couldn't shake. "Can you teach me?" The next morning, Nelson was chopping wood when he noticed a bright speck of red in the snow near the tree line. He walked over, bent down, and picked it up. A small, knitted wool mitten, the right one of a pair. The girl, Nora, must have dropped it on her way back to town yesterday. He stood there, holding it, feeling the weight of a choice. He could leave it where it was. Let her come back for it if she wanted. He could take it into town himself, leave it at Pritchard's store with a note saying where he'd found it. Or he could do the thing every instinct he had told him not to do. He could return it directly to the child and her family. For 12 years, Nelson had avoided all unnecessary contact with the town. He had built walls of silence and distance, and they had served him well. Grief couldn't touch him if he didn't let anyone get close. Guilt couldn't compound if he didn't risk caring again. But this little red mitten in his rough hand felt like a kind of test. A choice between the safe isolation he had chosen and something else, something he couldn't quite name, but which felt dangerously like hope. The walk into town felt longer than usual. Nelson was keenly aware of the eyes watching him from windows, of conversations that stopped as he passed. He kept his gaze fixed ahead, the mitten tucked in his coat pocket. He knew where the boarding house was. Everyone did. It was the largest building on the north side of the street, 3 stories of white-painted wood with a wide front porch. He mounted the steps, his heavy boots thudding on the planks, and knocked on the door. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet morning. Footsteps approached, and then the door opened. A tall, thin woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun regarded him with immediate suspicion. Pauline Mercer. He'd seen her in town, always walking with a sense of purpose, always with a look on her face like she'd just tasted something sour. Yes? The single word was curt, unfriendly. Nelson pulled out the mitten. The girl dropped this near my property. I thought she might be needing it. Pauline's eyes flicked to the mitten, then back to his face, her expression hardening. Near his property? You could see the thought forming. She was wandering in the woods, near his cabin. I sent her home, he said, answering the unspoken question. It's cold out. A child needs both her mittens. They stared at each other, and Nelson could see her mind working, see her forming judgments, adding this to whatever stories she'd heard about him. Behind her, he caught a flash of red hair. Nora was peeking around the doorframe, her face lighting up when she saw him. Mr. Nelson, she called. But Pauline turned on her sharply. Nora, go to your room, now. But Aunt Pauline, the child vanished. Pauline turned back to Nelson, snatching the mitten from his hand as if it were contaminated. My niece will not be wandering near your cabin again, Mr. Rourke. I trust you understand that. I understand, Nelson said. And he did. He understood that the town's barriers hadn't fallen just because a child was curious. He understood that people like Pauline Mercer had long memories and hard hearts. He understood that nothing had changed. He turned to leave, but Pauline's voice stopped him. Mr. Rourke, I know you've had your troubles. The whole town knows. But that doesn't give you the right to seek the attention of a child. Nora is my responsibility now, and I will not have her exposed to... She paused, searching for the right word. Unsuitable influences. Nelson looked at her, really looked, and saw not just judgment, but fear. She was afraid of him, afraid of what he represented. Tragedy, loss, the kind of grief that could swallow a person whole. I have no claim on anyone, he said quietly. I was just returning a lost mitten. He walked away then, back toward his cabin, feeling the weight of the town's eyes on him once more. Inside the boarding house, Nora pressed her face to her bedroom window, watching the big man with the sad eyes walk away, wondering why her aunt was so angry, wondering if she would ever see him again. And on the shelf in Nelson's cabin, a little wooden fox waited, carved with more care than anything he had made in years, for a child who might never return to receive it. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. Nelson told himself he was relieved the child hadn't come back. It was better this way, simpler. He threw himself into his routines with a renewed determination, checking his trap lines in the high country, chopping wood until his shoulders ached, anything to keep his mind occupied. But at night, when the work was done and the cabin settled into its familiar silence, he would find his eyes drifting to the small carved fox on the shelf. He should put it away with the others. He should forget the red-haired girl with the curious eyes who had asked if he could teach her. On the 9th day, Nelson was returning from his trap lines when he noticed prints in the snow near his property. Small boot prints, coming from the direction of town. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, as if someone had stood there watching, and then turned back. His chest tightened. She had come back after all, but she hadn't approached. She had stood at the boundary, as if she understood it wasn't her place to cross. The next morning, he found her there again. Not at the edge this time, but sitting on a fallen log about 20 yards from his cabin, her red coat a bright splash against the snow. She watched him chop wood, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Nelson stopped mid-swing, the heavy axe in his hands. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then, Nora stood up, brushed the snow from her coat, and walked toward him with the kind of single-minded purpose only children possess. "My aunt says I'm not supposed to talk to you," she announced. "Then you should listen to her. She says a lot of things." Nora tilted her head, studying him. "Are you really dangerous?" The question, so direct and innocent, caught him off guard. "No." He paused, reconsidered. "Your aunt is probably right, though. You should stay away." "That's not what I asked." Nelson set the axe down and wiped his brow with the back of his glove. The child was persistent in a way that unsettled him. "No," he said finally. "I'm not dangerous, but I'm not good company either." "You seem fine to me." She glanced past him toward the cabin. "Do you still have those carvings? The ones in the window?" He nodded slowly. "Can I see them up close?" Every sensible part of Nelson's mind screamed no. Every instinct told him to send her away, to maintain the barriers he had so carefully built. But there was something in her face, an openness, a lack of judgment he hadn't seen in another human being for 12 years. And he was tired. So tired of the barriers. For just a minute he heard himself say, "Well, you'd better come inside then." Nora's face lit up like a sunrise, and she followed him to the cabin. He opened the door and stepped aside, watching as she entered his sanctuary, her eyes wide. The space was tidy, but simple. A table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and the fireplace with its mantle of carved animals above it. Everything a man needed, and nothing he didn't. But Nora went straight to the mantel, rising on her tiptoes to get a better look. "Oh," she breathed. "There are so many." There were dozens of them, created over years of silent nights. Bears, moose, eagles, rabbits, foxes, and owls, each carved with meticulous attention to detail. Each one a meditation on form and grain, on the way wood could hold life if you knew how to look for it. "They're beautiful," Nora said, turning to him. "Did you make all of these?" "It's just something to do in the evenings." "It's not just something. It's art." She said the word with reverence, the same way his Catherine used to when she praised his work. The memory struck him like a physical blow, but Nora was still talking. Could you really teach me how to make them?" Nelson picked up a block of wood from the table, turning it over in his hands. His father's knife lay beside it, the handle worn smooth from years of use, the initials JR still visible where they'd been carved into the base. James Rock had taught his son to carve on quiet summer nights, when Nelson was not much older than this girl. His father's patient voice came back to him across the years. The wood will tell you what it wants to be. You just have to listen. It isn't easy, Nelson said, still looking at the wood. It takes patience, and you can cut yourself if you're not careful. I'm very patient, Nora told him solemnly, and I'll be careful. Nelson looked up at her, saw the sincerity in her expression, and felt something shift inside him. A small but definite crack in the wall. I suppose I can show you the basics, but you need your aunt's permission. Nora's face fell. She'll never say yes. Then I can't teach you. I won't go behind her back. But that's not fair. Maybe not. But that's how it is. He gestured to the door. You should go now, before she notices you're gone. Nora walked reluctantly to the door, then stopped. Mr. Nelson, why does everyone avoid you? The question was so direct, it almost made him laugh. Adults would never ask such a thing so plainly. They'd talk around it, make assumptions, invent stories. But children had no such filter. Because I let them, he told her simply. Now go. She left, but not without one last, wistful look at the shelf of carved animals. Nelson watched from the window as she trudged through the snow toward town, a small red figure against the white landscape. He turned back to his cabin, suddenly aware of how silent it was, how empty. For 12 years, he'd told himself that solitude was what he wanted, what he deserved. But the presence of that child had made the silence feel different, heavier. He picked up his father's knife, feeling the familiar weight in his palm. The initials on the handle caught the firelight. James Rock had been a good man, a patient teacher. He believed that a skill passed from hand to hand, from one generation to the next, was a kind of immortality. When you teach someone what you know, he'd told a young Nelson, you give them a piece of yourself that outlives you. Nelson had no one to pass his skills to. His own daughter had been too young, and then she was gone, taking with her any thought of legacy or continuation. He'd carved alone for years, the animals accumulating on the shelf. Beautiful and useless, with no one to see them. Now a child had asked him to teach her, had looked at his work and called it art, had seen him not as a dangerous mountain man, but as someone who might have something worth learning. He set the knife down and rubbed his face with both hands. This was dangerous territory. Caring led to loss. Connection led to pain. He knew that better than anyone. But the memory of Nora's face, lit up in admiration for his carvings, wouldn't leave him. That night, almost without conscious decision, he began to work on something new. Not one of his usual animals, but something different. He chose a piece of soft pine, good for a beginner, and began to shape it into something simple. A bird, perhaps, something a child could manage with guidance. His hands moved with practiced skill, the knife gliding through the wood in smooth, controlled cuts. He worked by the firelight, the only sounds the whisper of the blade on wood and the crackle of burning logs. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the tracks Nora had left, erasing the evidence of her visit. But inside, something had changed. The walls Nelson had built were still standing, but a crack had formed, and through that crack, a light was beginning to shine. The next morning brought fresh snow and a clear sky. Nelson was banking the fire, preparing to check his trap lines, when he heard voices outside. He went to the window and saw Nora approaching, but this time she wasn't alone. She walked beside a man Nelson recognized, Vernon Pritchard, who ran the general store. George Pritchard's younger brother, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle manner. Nelson stepped outside as they reached the clearing. Vernon raised a hand in greeting. "Morning, Nelson." Nelson's eyes went to Nora, who was practically vibrating with suppressed excitement. "Can I help you with something, Vernon?" "Actually, I've come to help you with something. This young lady came by my store yesterday, told me a story about your carvings, and how she asked you to teach her, and how you said she needed permission." Vernon smiled. "Her aunt, Pauline, is my cousin, you know. Known her all my life. I had a talk with her last night about being a bit too hard on the girl." "I didn't ask you to do that," Nelson began. "I know you didn't. But I remember you from before, Nelson. I remember the man you were before the tragedy. And I've watched you these 12 years. Seen how you keep to yourself, never causing trouble, just living quiet. And I got to wondering if maybe the town hadn't done you a disservice, keeping you at arm's length the way we have." Nelson felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected this. "Long story short," Vernon continued, "Pauline has agreed to let Nora visit you for an hour each afternoon, on the condition that I vouch for you, which I do, and on the condition the girl is back promptly when her time is up. She figured it might keep Nora out of trouble and teach her something useful." He put a hand on Nora's shoulder. "And I'll be checking in regularly to make sure everyone's comfortable with the arrangement." Nora was beaming up at Nelson now, her eyes shining. "So you can teach me? For real?" Nelson looked from the child to Vernon, feeling something close to panic. This was happening too fast, prying open doors he'd kept locked for a good reason. But Vernon's expression was kind, understanding, and Nora was so full of hope it hurt to look at her more. I suppose so," Nelson said slowly. "We can start with something simple." Nora gave a little skip of pure joy, which made Vernon chuckle. "Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Thank you, thank you." "But there are rules," Nelson said, his voice firm. "You do exactly what I say. You don't touch the knife unless I tell you to, and if you get distracted or careless, the lessons stop. Understood?" "Understood." Vernon nodded in approval. "I'll leave you two to it then. I'll be back in an hour to walk her home." He looked at Nelson, and there was something meaningful in his gaze. "It's good to see you engaging with people again, Nelson, even if it's just teaching a child to carve." After Vernon left, Nelson stood awkwardly with Nora, suddenly unsure how to proceed. He had spent so much time alone that the presence of another person in his space felt strange, almost overwhelming. "Well," he said finally, "let me see your hands." Nora held them out. They were small, her fingers thin, her nails bitten down. A child's hands, soft and unmarked by hard work. "You're going to get splinters," Nelson said, "and probably a cut or two, even if you're careful. Your aunt won't like that." "I don't mind splinters." Nelson almost smiled. Almost. "All right then. It's too cold out here for delicate work." Inside the cabin, he showed her the piece of pine he'd started the night before, the rough outline of a bird already visible in the wood. "This is what we'll work on," he said. "But first, you need to understand the knife." He picked up his father's knife and held it where she could see. "This was my father's. These initials, J.R., that was for James Rock. He taught me to carve when I was about your age." "Is he—" Nora started, then trailed off, unsure how to finish. "He passed 10 years ago, but what he taught me is still here." Nelson turned the knife in his hands. That's what teaching does. It keeps people alive in what they pass on. He let her hold the knife, watching carefully as she felt its weight and balance. It's sharp, she said, nodding. Very sharp. That's why you're going to watch me first. Watch how I hold it. How I always cut away from myself, how I let the wood guide the blade. He took it back and began to work, his movements slow and deliberate, so she could follow. See? Small cuts. Patience. The wood will tell you what it wants to be, if you listen. Nora watched with absolute focus, leaning forward, her eyes tracking his every move. And Nelson, who hadn't taught anyone anything in over a decade, found himself falling into the rhythm of it, explaining, demonstrating, answering her questions with a patience he thought he had lost. The hour went by faster than he would have thought possible. When Vernon's knock came at the door, Nelson was startled to realize how far the sun had moved. The time had simply vanished. "Time to go, little bit," Vernon said gently. Nora looked at Nelson with pleading eyes. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Nelson hesitated, then nodded. "If your aunt allows it." "She will. Mr. Vernon will make sure." She handed him the piece of pine they'd been working on. "Will you keep this safe until I get back?" "I will." After they left, Nelson stood alone in his cabin with the piece of wood in his hands. It was just the start of a rough, unfinished bird, but it represented something he hadn't felt in 12 years. Connection. The simple pleasure of sharing knowledge, of connecting with another person, even if that person was just a curious child. He placed the bird carefully on his workbench and looked around the cabin. Somehow, it felt different. Less like a tomb and more like a home. And that thought, that small shift in perspective, terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Nora came back the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and the one after that. Every day she arrived, sometimes with Vernon, sometimes on her own, always punctual, always eager. And every day, Nelson found himself looking forward to her knock on the door in a way that both surprised and unsettled him. The lessons began simply. He taught her how to hold the knife properly, how to read the grain of the wood, how to make the small, controlled cuts that kept the blade from slipping toward her fingers. She was a quick study, attentive and careful, though her small hands struggled with the resistance of the wood at first. "It's harder than it looks," she said one afternoon, frustration in her voice as a cut went awry. "Anything worth doing is," Nelson replied. He took her piece and examined it. "This isn't ruined, though. See here? You can work with what you have. Sometimes the mistakes show you a better path." He demonstrated, and Nora tried again, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. This time the cut was cleaner. "Better," Nelson said, and the smile that broke across her face was like sunlight through the clouds. But not everyone in Pine Ridge was pleased. The lessons had been going on for 2 weeks, when Aunt Pauline appeared at Nelson's door one evening, her face tight with disapproval. "Mr. Rock," she said, getting straight to the point, "I need to have a word with you." Nelson stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. "Ma'am, Reverend Michaels came to see me today. It seems several members of the congregation have expressed concern about Nora spending time up here with you." She crossed her arms. "They say it isn't proper, that people will talk." "People are already talking," Nelson said calmly. "They've been talking about me for 12 years. That is precisely the point. I have a reputation, Mr. Rock, Fair or not, that is the reality, and I have a responsibility to that child. I'm teaching her to carve, that's all. I'm not saying you've done anything wrong, but appearances matter in a small town. Pauline's expression softened slightly. A 6-year-old girl, spending every afternoon alone with a bachelor. It gives cause for speculation. Nelson felt a hot anger rise in his chest. You think I would harm a child? After everything I've lost? I have to think about what's best for Nora, and that includes protecting her reputation as well as her safety. They stood in silence. Finally, Nelson spoke. She's happy when she's here. When was the last time you saw her that happy at the boarding house? The blow landed. Pauline's face was a canvas of guilt. Happiness isn't everything. Structure, discipline, proper decorum. She's 6 years old. She's lost her parents. Maybe happiness should count for something. Don't you dare tell me how to raise my niece. Pauline's voice turned to ice. I'm reconsidering our arrangement. You should be prepared for the possibility that Nora won't be coming back. She turned to leave, then paused. If it's worth anything, Vernon insists you're a good man, and Nora talks about you constantly. So I won't forbid the visits. Yet. But I am watching, Mr. Rock. And if the whispers in town get too loud, I will put an end to this. Understood? Understood. After she left, Nelson stood in the twilight, his hand clenched into fists. The anger burned in his chest. It wasn't aimed at Pauline. She was just protecting her niece. His rage was for the town, for the stories they spun, for the way they decided who he was without ever asking. But beneath the anger was fear, a fear that he was starting to care. And caring meant vulnerability. And vulnerability meant pain. The next afternoon, Nora arrived with Vernon, but her eyes were red-rimmed. What happened? Nelson asked her. Some of the girls at church, Vernon said, his voice low. Said some unkind things about where Nora spends her afternoons. They said you're scary, Nora said in a small voice. That there's something wrong with me for wanting to come here. Nelson's chest tightened. Maybe they're right. Maybe you shouldn't come here anymore. No! Nora's reply was fierce. They don't know you. They don't know about the carvings or how you teach me. They just believe the stories. Stories have power. They can hurt you. So, let's make a better story. She looked up at him, her small face set with determination. Let's show them they're wrong. Nelson found himself thinking of his father's words. The wood will tell you what it wants to be. You just have to listen. Maybe people were like that too. Maybe he'd been so busy being what the town expected. He'd forgotten he could choose to be something else. Come inside, he said. Let's work on your bird. Inside, Nora picked up her carving, her hands confident now. That girl said you lost your family in a fire. Is that true? Nelson's hands stilled. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, he did. Yes. Is that why you live alone? Part of the reason. You were away when it happened. It wasn't a question. I was in the mountains, checking my trap lines. The words came out rough, like splintered wood. When I returned, there was nothing left but ash. My wife, Catherine. My daughter, Lily. She was 5. That's why you're teaching me. Because I remind you of her. Maybe at first, but now, you're just you. And teaching you, it reminds me that I used to be more than just the man who lives alone on the edge of town. You're still more than that, Nora said firmly. You're an artist. And a teacher. They worked in silence as the snow began to fall outside. As the afternoon wound down, Nelson went to his shelf and chose a small carving, a rabbit with alert ears and bright, knowing eyes. "This is for you," he said, "your first completed piece. But I didn't make this one. Consider it inspiration, something to remind you what you're working toward." Nora stared at the rabbit. Then suddenly, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist in a quick, tight hug. Nelson froze. It had been 12 years since anyone had hugged him. Before he could respond, she stepped back, the rabbit clutched in her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Nelson, for everything." After she was gone, Nelson stood alone, still feeling the phantom pressure of small arms around his waist. Something was shifting inside him. Some long-frozen part of him was beginning to thaw. That night, he did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the shelf and took down the worn leather journal. Inside were pressed flowers Catherine had picked, recipes, observations about their life together, and, tucked in the back, letters he had started to Lily after she was gone. Letters he never finished. He turned to a blank page and picked up a pencil. Then he began to write. "Dear Lily, a little girl hugged me today. Her name is Nora, and she has your stubborn spirit. I'm teaching her to carve like your grandfather taught me. I thought teaching would hurt, that it would remind me too much of what I'd lost. But instead, it reminds me that I'm still alive." He stopped, his throat tight and his vision blurred, but he didn't close the journal. Instead, he left it open on the table, the words exposed. The act of writing them a kind of acknowledgement that he was still here, still capable of connection. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside Nelson's cabin, something was growing, fragile and hesitant, but unmistakably alive. Winter deepened over Pine Ridge, and with it came a subtle shift in Nelson's days. Where before, his mornings stretched empty beyond basic survival, he now found himself planning for the afternoon's lesson. He'd select the wood the night before, considering what might work for Nora's skill level. It had been 3 weeks since her lessons started, and Nora's bird was taking shape. The raw pine now showed the sweep of wings, a fanned tail, the suggestion of a head turned to one side. It wasn't refined work, but it had character. It had heart. One gray afternoon, when the sky hung low and heavy, Nora arrived and immediately sensed something different. Nelson was standing by the window, his back to the door, his shoulders rigid. In his hand he held something that caught the weak winter light. A silver locket on a tarnished chain. "Mr. Nelson?" she said softly. He turned, and she saw his face was drawn, his eyes distant. "Sorry. Today might not be. I'm not sure I'm good company." But Nora had already shrugged off her coat. "What's that?" she asked, nodding at the locket. Nelson looked down at it, as if surprised to find it in his hand. "Something I haven't taken off in a long time." He hesitated, then opened it with a soft click. Inside were 2 photographs, faded and worn. A woman with kind eyes and dark hair, a child with a tangle of curls and a gap-toothed smile. "Is that your family?" Nora asked, moving closer. "Yes. Catherine and Lily." The names came out like a prayer. "They're beautiful." Nelson's throat worked. Catherine had a laugh that could fill a room. She used to sing while she cooked. Lily, she was afraid of thunder, but she loved lightning. She'd stand at the window during a storm, counting the seconds between the flash and the sound. "Like me," Nora said. I love lightning too. Yes, like you. Nelson closed the locket gently, but didn't put it away. He just stood there, holding it, lost. She waited, the way he had taught her to wait with the wood, patient, letting things happen in their own time. Finally, he began to speak again. It was February, 12 years ago this month. The words came out slowly, painfully. I'd gone up into the mountains, checking my trap lines, planned to be gone 3 days. Catherine kissed me goodbye. Lily made me promise to bring her back a rabbit's foot for luck. He walked to the table and sat down heavily. Nora sat across from him. The second night, the temperature dropped. Hard. I knew I should head back, but I thought I had time. I had one more line to check. He shook his head. That one bit of pride. It cost me everything. You couldn't have known, Nora said softly. The fire started in the chimney. A stray ember must have caught the creosote. It happens in winter. But our cabin was built tight, sealed against the cold. It meant the smoke had nowhere to go. Nora's hand slid across the table toward his, resting near his fingers. A connection without demand. They say Catherine tried to get out. The door was barred from the outside. We'd been having trouble with scavengers, so I'd installed a heavy crossbar. She couldn't lift it herself. By the time the neighbors saw the flames, it was too late. The silence that followed was heavy with grief. Outside, the snow began to fall again, drifting past the window pane. I came back on the third day to ash and stone. The chimney was still standing, and that damned bar I'd put there to keep them safe, lay in the ruins like an accusation. It wasn't your fault, Nora said, her voice clear and sure. The town didn't see it that way. Oh, they never said it outright, but I could see it in their faces, hear it in the silences. Where was he? What kind of man leaves his family alone in the dead of winter? If you'd been there, you might have died too, Nora said. Then I wouldn't have met you. I wouldn't be learning to carve. Nelson looked at her, really looked, and saw something that took his breath away. It wasn't pity, but simple acceptance. This child saw his pain and held space for it, without trying to fix it. After the funeral, he went on, people tried to help, brought food, offered shelter, but I couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand their kindness or their judgment. So I built this cabin, as far from town as I could manage, and I closed the door on all of them. On everyone, Nora said. On everyone. He turned the locket in his hands. I told myself I was protecting them from my grief. But really, I was protecting myself. If I didn't let anyone in, I couldn't lose them. Couldn't fail them like I failed Catherine and Lily. But you didn't fail them, Nora insisted. You loved them. You still love them. That's not failing. Love wasn't enough to save them. Love is never about saving people. It's about being with them. My mother used to say that love isn't a shield. It's a light. It doesn't stop bad things from happening, but it helps you see in the dark. Nelson stared at her, stunned. Your mother was a wise woman. She was. But she died anyway. Her and my father. Nora's voice wobbled, but didn't break. And it hurts every day. But I'm glad I got to love them. Even if it hurts now, I'm glad. They sat in the quiet, two people who understood loss. The fire crackled, the snow fell harder, and slowly, carefully, Nelson reached out and covered Nora's small hand with his own. I've worn this every day for 12 years, he said, his voice low. Never took it off. not once. It was like, if I kept them close, maybe I wouldn't forget them. You won't forget, Nora said. Never. The memories don't go away. They just change. They get softer, maybe, but they don't go away. Nelson opened the locket again, studying the faces that haunted him, and for the first time looking at them didn't feel like drowning. It still ached, but the ache was now a bearable weight, a shared one. Catherine would have liked you, he said. She always said the world needed more people who saw beneath the surface of things. Something in Nelson's chest broke open in that moment, some final defense giving way. He closed the locket and lifted the chain from his neck, removing it for the first time in 12 years. He set it on the table between them, no longer a weight around his neck, but something he could choose to pick up or to set down. Thank you, he said. For what? For seeing me, the real me, not the story the town tells. Nora smiled. Can we work on my bird now? And just like that, the moment shifted. They moved to the workbench, and Nelson guided her hands as she shaped the bird's wings. They worked in a comfortable silence, the kind that comes when presence is enough. As the afternoon waned and Nora prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Mr. Nelson, can you tell me more about them sometime? About Catherine and Lily. I'd like to know them. Nelson nodded, not trusting his voice. After she was gone, he stood at the window, watching her trudge through the deepening snow. The locket lay on the table where he'd left it, and for the first time, leaving it there felt like a choice, not a loss. He picked it up gently and opened it one more time. I'm still here, he whispered to the faces inside. I'm still here, and I am trying to live again. The photographs offered no reply, but somehow, in the silence of his cabin, with snow falling softly outside, Nelson felt a kind of peace he hadn't known in 12 years. The days that followed felt different, as if removing the locket had lifted some invisible burden. He still thought of Catherine and Lily. He would always think of them. But the memories had changed in their texture, less like open wounds and more like old scars, still tender, but no longer bleeding. Nora continued her visits, and Nelson found himself sharing more than just carving techniques. He told her stories of his life before the tragedy, of growing up in the mountains, of the winter he and Catherine had been snowed in for 3 weeks. One afternoon, as they sat working by the fire, Nora asked, "Did you read to Lily, like my parents used to read to me?" Nelson's hands stilled. Every night. There had been one book in particular, a collection of fairy tales. Lily had known most of them by heart, but still, she'd wanted to hear them again and again. I had a book like that, Nora said quietly. I had to leave it behind when I came here. Pauline said I could only bring one bag. Nelson set down his carving and walked to a wooden chest in the corner. He had avoided opening it for years, but now he lifted the lid without hesitation. Inside lay the remnants of his old life. Catherine's shawl, Lily's tiny boots, and wrapped in oilcloth, the book. He carried it back to the table and unwrapped it carefully. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. Lily's book, he said, placing it between them. Nora's eyes widened. Oh, she whispered, her hand hovering over it, not quite daring to touch. Would you like me to read to you? The words were out before Nelson had fully formed the thought. Yes, please, Nora said softly. Nelson opened the book, and a familiar scent rose to meet him. Old paper, dust, and something that might have been Catherine's perfume. He found a story near the middle, one of Lily's favorites, and began to read. His voice was rusty at first, uncertain. He hadn't read aloud in 12 years, but as the words flowed, something loosened in his chest. The story came to life again, a tale of a lost child who finds her way home through a dark forest, guided by the kindness of animals. Nora listened with rapt attention, her own carving forgotten. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Lily had good taste, she said finally. Nelson smiled, a true smile. She did. She always said the best stories were the ones where kindness mattered more than strength. She was right. Nora looked at the book. May I? Would you mind if I borrowed it for a few days? I promise I'll take good care of it. A tightness seized Nelson's throat. The book was one of the few tangible connections he had left to his daughter. But looking at Nora's hopeful face, he knew he wanted to share this treasure. You can borrow it, he said. But you have to promise me one thing. Anything. Read it by the firelight, if you can. That's how Lily always wanted it. She said the shadows made the stories more real. Nora nodded solemnly. I promise. She carefully wrapped the book in the oilcloth and tucked it inside her coat. They returned to their carving, but something had shifted between them again. Another wall had come down. The following afternoon brought a surprise. Vernon arrived with Nora, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Raymond Cole, the town sheriff. Nelson tensed automatically. Had Pauline finally made good on her threat? But Vernon's expression was calm. Afternoon, Nelson. Mind if we come in for a minute? Nelson stepped aside and they entered, Nora going immediately to her place at the workbench. What is this about? Nelson asked, his voice wary. Raymond removed his hat. I came to apologize, and to tell you something you ought to know. Nelson waited. There's been talk at the general store, Raymond continued. Vernon here's been speaking up for you, telling folks about the lessons, about how good you are with young Nora. And it's got some of us remembering things we'd conveniently forgotten. I don't understand, Nelson said. Vernon spoke up. What Raymond's trying to say is, you've done good things for this town over the years. Things people chose not to remember. You recall the spring flood 7 years back? Nelson shrugged. There are a lot of spring floods. And you were the one who rode ahead, warned everyone, and helped evacuate the low-lying houses. 3 children would have drowned if you hadn't pulled them from that current, Raymond said. And when old Mrs. Peterson's roof collapsed under the snow, you showed up with lumber and tools. When the blacksmith's forge cracked, you helped him fix it. He paused, shaking his head. We've been treating you like a dangerous outsider, when you've always been a good neighbor. An uncomfortable warmth rose in Nelson's chest. Why are you telling me this now? Because that little girl over there, Raymond nodded toward Nora. She saw what we should have seen all along. And some of us are ashamed it took a child to show us how wrong we were. The silence that followed was heavy. Nelson looked at the 2 men and saw genuine regret in their faces. I appreciate you coming here, Nelson said finally. But I'm not looking for apologies. We're not offering charity, Vernon said. We're offering community. Raymond pulled out a folded piece of paper. The church is holding a winter festival next month. We'd like you to display some of your carvings. Let people see your work. Let them understand that you've been creating beauty all these years. Nelson took the paper, but didn't unfold it. "And if you say no, we'll respect that," Raymond said. "But I hope you won't. You've been in exile long enough, Nelson. It's time to come home." After they left, Nelson stood holding the paper. "What do you think?" asked Nora. "I think you should do it," she said at once. "Your carvings are beautiful. Everyone should see them." He unfolded the paper and read the details. A winter festival, 2 weeks away. Tables set up in the church hall. Nothing formal, nothing demanding. Just a chance to be part of the town again. The old Nelson would have thrown it in the fire. But this Nelson was changing. "I'll think about it," he said. Nora's answering smile was worth more than any applause ever could be. That night, after Nora had returned the book that morning, Nelson took the worn storybook from its place on the shelf. He turned to Lily's favorite story and read it aloud to the empty cabin, his voice steady and sure. And as he read, he felt his daughter's presence, not as a weight of grief, but as the warmth of a memory. She was gone, and would always be gone. But she had taught him that kindness mattered more than strength, that love was a light in the darkness. Perhaps it was time he too found his way back home. Nelson spent the next week preparing. He selected his best carvings, a dozen pieces that showed the breadth of his skill. Each night he arranged and rearranged them, wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. Nora visited every afternoon, her enthusiasm a contagious antidote to his fear. "Everyone is going to love them," she'd insist. The festival was on a Saturday afternoon. By Friday night, Nelson had his carvings carefully wrapped in cloth, ready for transport. He'd even trimmed his beard and found a shirt without a patch. Saturday dawned clear and cold. Nelson packed his carvings into a sack and set off for town, his heart a heavy drum against his ribs. He was halfway there when he heard a child's voice calling his name. It came from behind him, from the direction of his cabin. He turned to see Nora running toward him through the snow, her coat unbuttoned, her head bare, moving with a desperate speed. "Nora!" He dropped the sack and caught her as she reached him. "What is it? What are you doing out here?" She was crying, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I had to find you." With trembling hands, she pulled something from her coat pocket. Nelson's breath caught. It was a handkerchief, small and delicate, with initials embroidered in one corner. Lily's handkerchief. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice sharp. "It fell out," Nora sobbed. "From Lily's book. I didn't know it was in there. It fell out this morning when I was reading, and I wanted to bring it back right away. So I ran to your cabin, but you were already gone." "It's all right," he said gently. "You've done nothing wrong." But Nora shook her head frantically. "That's not it. When I ran to your cabin, Aunt Pauline was coming up the trail. She was looking for me. She was angry, and she saw me leaving your cabin and—" Ice flooded Nelson's veins. "And what?" "She said terrible things, said you were encouraging me to lie, said the lessons had to stop. She's gone to town now to tell everyone that you're not fit to be around children." Nelson stood frozen in the snow, the familiar weight of judgment crashing down on him. Of course. He had been a fool to think things could change. "You should go back to town," he said quietly. "No." Nora grabbed his coat. "You have to come. You have to tell them the truth. They won't believe me." "Then I'll tell them," Nora said, her voice fierce. "I'll make them listen." Nelson looked down at this small, determined child and felt something stir in his chest, something that felt almost like courage. "All right," he said, picking up his sack. "Let's face this together." They walked side by side toward town. As they neared the church, Nelson saw a crowd gathered outside. He recognized faces: Vernon, Raymond, George Pritchard from the general store, Mrs. Peterson, the Reverend, and at the center of it all, Pauline Mercer, her face a tight mask of fury. The crowd noticed their approach, and the conversation died. Nelson felt every eye turn to him. Pauline saw them, and her expression hardened. "Nora, you come here right now." Before Nora could move, Vernon stepped forward. "Hold on, Pauline. Let's hear what happened before we jump to conclusions." "What happened is she's been sneaking around, lying to me, going to his cabin unsupervised." "I wasn't sneaking," Nora said, her voice small but clear. "I was returning something." "The point," Vernon cut in firmly, "is that you're making accusations without knowing the facts. Nelson has been teaching Nora to carve. He has been patient and kind. I've been checking in regularly." "You saw what he wanted you to see," Pauline retorted. "What about how he saved 3 children from drowning?" Raymond's voice boomed over the crowd. "Or how he's helped half this town at one time or another, and lived quietly and bothered no one for 12 years. The crowd murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Then Mrs. Peterson spoke up. "I'd like to say something." She stepped forward. "3 winters ago, my roof gave in. Nelson showed up with lumber and tools, and he worked in the freezing cold to make my home safe again. He never asked for a dime. He helped me repair my forge," the blacksmith added. "He's traded fair with me for 12 years, said George Pritchard. One by one, people stepped forward with stories, small acts of kindness that Nelson himself had forgotten. The town's narrative of the dangerous hermit was crumbling before his eyes. Pauline stood in the middle of it, her certainty wavering. "But he's been alone with a child. It isn't proper." "Nothing improper happened." Nora's voice suddenly rang out, stronger now. "Mr. Nelson taught me to carve. He told me about his family. He read to me from Lily's book. He was kind when everyone else told me to be quiet. He was my friend when I needed one." Her voice broke, and Nelson felt his own eyes burn. This child was fighting for him in a way no one had in a dozen years. Vernon moved closer to Pauline. "Cousin, you're not protecting her from danger. You're protecting her from connection, from joy. Don't let your fear make you cruel." Pauline looked at her niece, at Nelson, at the crowd of people who had just testified to his character. Her face was a battleground of emotions. "I just want her to be safe," she said at last, her voice quiet. "She is safe," Vernon said gently. "She's safe and happy and learning something beautiful." Pauline's shoulders slumped. She looked at Nora, truly looked at her, and seemed to see the happiness, the confidence the child had gained. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Nora. "I was so focused on doing what I thought was right. I didn't see what you needed." Nora ran to her aunt, and Pauline folded her into a stiff but genuine embrace. Over the child's head, Pauline met Nelson's eyes. "I was wrong about you," she said, her voice clear for him to hear. "I let fear guide me instead of truth. My apologies." Nelson managed a nod, not trusting his voice. The Reverend finally spoke. "Well then, I believe we have a festival to attend. Nelson, I do hope you brought your carvings to display." Nelson lifted the sack. "I did." "Then let us see them," the Reverend said, his voice warm. "Let's celebrate the art that has been hidden in our midst for far too long." As Nelson followed the crowd into the church hall, unwrapping his sculptures and arranging them on a table. People gathered to admire his work. And he felt something he hadn't felt in 12 years. He felt he belonged. It was all because a 6-year-old girl with red hair and a stubborn heart had refused to accept the story everyone told about him and insisted on writing a better one. Lily's handkerchief had forced a confrontation, but in doing so, it had given Nelson something he thought he'd lost forever: the chance to be seen, truly seen, and accepted anyway. The Winter Festival marked a turning point, but not in the way Nelson had expected. He'd imagined acceptance would feel like a triumph. Instead, it was awkward and uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. People spoke to him now. Women who once crossed the street to avoid him now smiled and asked about his carvings. Men who'd never given him a second glance now nodded in greeting. The attention was exhausting. "You'll get used to it," Vernon said one afternoon. "Being part of a community takes practice when you've been on your own as long as you have." "Maybe being on my own was better," Nelson muttered. Vernon's expression grew serious. "You don't mean that." Nelson didn't answer, but he knew Vernon was right. The loneliness had been a slow poison, but that didn't make the adjustment any easier. His true comfort came during Nora's continued visits, in the quiet of his cabin. Working on their carvings, Nelson could breathe again. "You know what I think?" Nora said one afternoon, shaping the wing on her own wooden bird. "I think you're brave." Nelson almost laughed. "Brave? I've been hiding from the world for 12 years. Being brave isn't about not being afraid," she said, her young voice full of conviction. "It's doing things even when you are afraid." Her words stayed with him. That night, he wrote in his journal, "I'm trying to be the man you would have wanted me to be. Trying to honor your memory, not by hiding from life, but by living it." 2 weeks after the festival, Vernon arrived with troubling news. The town council had called a formal meeting at the church that evening. They wanted Nelson to attend. "What about?" Nelson asked, his shoulders tensing. "Pauline's been asking questions. About your property. About whether it's proper for a single man to be living so close to town. There are still some folks who aren't comfortable with you and Nora spending time together." "So what am I supposed to do? Go defend my right to exist on my own land?" "You're supposed to go and speak your truth," Vernon said firmly. "Let them ask their questions, and you give them honest answers." The old urge to flee, to disappear into the mountains, rose within him. But then he thought of Nora, of the lessons that would end if he left, of the trust she had placed in him. He couldn't run. Not this time. That evening, Nelson walked into the church. The sanctuary had been arranged with chairs facing a long table where the 5 council members sat: the Reverend, the Mayor, 2 town elders, and Pauline Mercer. The pews were full, and in the back row, he saw Nora. When she caught his eye, she straightened her shoulders and gave him a small, encouraging nod. The Reverend began the meeting. "We are here to address concerns regarding Nelson Rock and his presence in our community. This is not a trial, but a conversation." The mayor asked about Nelson's legal claim to his property. Nelson explained his homestead claim, properly filed 14 years prior. Then Mrs. Keller, a town elder, spoke. "Mr. Rock, can you tell us your intentions regarding young Nora Mercer? Some are concerned about the nature of your relationship with the child." Nelson kept his voice steady. "My intention is to teach her a skill I know: wood carving. She is a bright child who showed an interest, and I have been sharing what I know with her aunt's permission." "But why?" Mrs. Keller pressed. "What do you get out of it?" I get to remember what it feels like to be useful, to pass on something my father taught me, to see a child's face light up when she creates something beautiful. His voice grew thick with emotion. For 12 years, I have been alone with my grief. Teaching Nora has reminded me that I am more than that grief, that I still have something to offer. The church was silent. Then Pauline spoke softly. Mr. Rock, I need to ask you something difficult. Do you see Nora as a replacement for your daughter? The question landed like a physical blow. Nelson looked toward Nora in the back row and knew what he had to say. At first, yes. When she first appeared at my cabin, I saw Lily. I saw the daughter who never had the chance to grow up. And it hurt so much I almost sent Nora away. He took a deep breath. But as the weeks passed, I stopped seeing Lily. I started seeing Nora. Her stubbornness, her kindness, her way of ignoring what people say. She is not a replacement for my daughter. She is herself. Vernon spoke up. This is about two people who lost everything, finding a connection in an unexpected place. Yes, Nelson said, grateful. That's exactly it. The Reverend looked around. Does anyone else have questions? The blacksmith stood. Nelson helped me when I needed it most. If he says his intentions are pure, I believe him. Mrs. Peterson rose, her voice trembling slightly. This man fixed my roof when I had no one else. He is a good neighbor. I would trust him with any child in this town. One by one, others stood and spoke. Not all of them. There were still doubtful faces in the crowd, but enough spoke that the tide had clearly turned. Finally, the mayor addressed the room. It seems clear that Mr. Rock has been a positive presence in young Nora's life and in our community. Unless there are objections, I move that we recognize his claim as valid and raise no further questions as to his character. I agree, the Reverend said. It was over. As the meeting dispersed, people filed past Nelson. Some shook his hand. Others offered a respectful nod. Vernon clapped him on the shoulder. You did good. Nora appeared at his side, taking his hand. You were so brave. I was terrified, he admitted. That's what makes it brave. Pauline approached. Mr. Rock, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect Nora. But I see now that perhaps the best way to protect her is to trust the people who care for her. The lessons may continue, and thank you for what you've given her. After they had gone, Nelson walked slowly back to his cabin. The night was clear and cold, stars glittering in the ink-black sky. He felt exhausted, but also lighter somehow. Vernon walked with him part of the way. The town needed to ask those questions, and you needed to answer them, Vernon said. Now everyone knows where you stand, don't they? I'm still not sure where I stand. Vernon stopped. You stand as a member of this community. Flawed, grieving, doing your best, just like the rest of us. That's where you stand. Back in his cabin, Nelson sat by the fire. He didn't write that night. He simply sat in the silence. It was not the silence of isolation, but the silence of peace. Outside, the snow began to fall again, and inside, Nelson Rock felt, for the first time since he had lost everything, that he might truly be home. The week following the council meeting settled into a peaceful routine. Nora visited every afternoon, her bird carving finally complete. It was a beautiful piece showing a remarkable skill for a child her age. She placed it proudly on Nelson's mantle, next to his own work. and every time he looked at it, a warmth spread through his chest. "What should I make next?" she asked one afternoon as they sat by the fire, cups of hot cider warming their hands. "Whatever inspires you," Nelson told her. "Pick up a piece of wood, feel its weight, look at the grain. It will tell you what it wants to be." Nora smiled at the familiar advice. "That's what you always say." "Because it's always true." Outside, the weather had turned. The sky was low and heavy with the kind of gray that promised a hard snow. The temperature had been dropping steadily all day, and even inside, with the fire blazing, Nelson could feel the chill pressing against the walls. "A storm's coming," he said, gazing out the window. "A bad one by the feel of it. You should head back to town before it hits." Nora glanced at the darkening sky. "I don't want to leave yet. We just started looking at the new wood." "I know, but your aunt will worry if you get caught in this, and it's going to be a bad one. I can feel it in my bones." As if to confirm his words, the first flakes began to fall. Not the gentle snow of the past weeks, but hard pellets driven by a rising wind that rattled against the window panes. "I should go," Nora said reluctantly, setting down her cider. She pulled on her coat and wrapped her scarf around her neck. "I'll see you tomorrow, if this storm passes," Nelson said. "If not, you stay put where it's safe. Promise me." "I promise." She gave him a quick hug. "Stay warm, Mr. Nelson." "You too, kid." He watched from the doorway as she started down the path toward town, her red coat a bright splash of color against the whitening landscape. The wind was picking up now, bending the pines and whipping the snow into flurries. Nelson frowned. He should have insisted she leave earlier. But she'd be fine. The path to town was well worn, and she knew the way. 20 minutes max, and she'd be safe in the boarding house. Nelson shut the door and returned to the fire. He added another log, settling in for the coming cold. Outside, the storm intensified with frightening speed. Within minutes, the wind was howling around the cabin, driving snow so thick he could barely see the tree line. He tried to go about his evening routine, carving, reading, writing in his journal, but he couldn't shake a growing unease. The storm was worse than he'd anticipated, much worse, and Nora was out in it. "She's fine," he told himself. "Probably home by now, sitting by Pauline's fire, warm and safe." But the unease wouldn't leave. It grew with every gust of wind, every rattle of the shutters. Nelson went to the window and peered out, but visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The world was a wall of white, a howling void. He paced the length of the small cabin, unable to settle. The wind shrieked, and in its voice he heard echoes of another night when everything had gone wrong. Not a storm then, but fire, smoke, the searing knowledge that he had been too late, too far away, helpless to save the ones he loved most. "Stop it," he told himself. "That was then. This is now. Nora is fine." But what if she wasn't? What if she'd gotten turned around in the whiteout? What if she'd wandered off the path? He couldn't finish the thought. He couldn't stand the thought of another child lost, another failure, another weight of guilt to carry for the rest of his days. Nelson grabbed his heavy coat and hat, pulled on his thickest gloves, and wrapped a scarf around his face. Then he went to the corner where his old rescue rope lay coiled. The same rope he had used years ago when he'd saved those children from the flood. He had kept it all this time, maintained it, not quite knowing why. Now he knew. He secured one end of the rope firmly around the central support beam inside his cabin and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off his feet. The cold was brutal, seeping through his layers, and the snow was blinding, stinging, disorienting. Nelson aimed himself toward the town path and began to walk, the rope unspooling behind him. This was madness. He knew Nora was almost certainly safe at home. He was risking his life on an irrational fear. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't go back inside while even the smallest chance existed that she needed help. The path was already disappearing under the fresh snow. Nelson moved carefully, testing each footstep, using his knowledge of the terrain to guide him. The rope behind him was a lifeline. Without it, he would never find his way back to the cabin in this blizzard. He shouted her name, "Nora!" But the wind tore the word from his lips. He tried again, louder, but the storm swallowed his voice. He had gone perhaps 100 yards when he saw something that made his heart stop. Faint tracks in the snow, small boot prints, already half filled but still visible, leading not toward town, but away from it. Back toward his cabin. She had lost her way, disoriented in the raging storm. Instead of heading toward safety, she wandered deeper into the forest. "Nora!" he shouted, his voice laced with panic, carrying as far as it could. "Nora, can you hear me?" Nothing but the howling wind, swirling snow, and the dreadful certainty that she was lost out there. Nelson followed her footprints, moving as quickly as he dared. The rope trailed behind him, 50 meters, 75, 100. How far had she gone? How long had she been out here? The tracks were fading fast, soon to vanish entirely, leaving him with nothing to guide him. He quickened his pace, his breath ragged, his legs burning from the effort of pushing through the deepening snowdrifts. Then, he spotted it. A flash of red, barely visible through the white curtain of the storm. A small, hunched figure struggling onward. Nora. He ran toward her, closing the distance. "Nora, stop!" She turned at the sound of his voice, her face pale and frightened, snow clinging to her lashes and hair. "Mr. Nelson?" Her voice was weak, trembling with fear. "I got lost. I couldn't see. I tried to come back, but I couldn't find the way." I know. It's all right now, I'm here." He reached her, knelt in the snow, and pulled her close. She was shaking. He couldn't tell if from cold or terror. "Are you hurt?" "Just cold, so very cold." Nelson glanced around, trying to get his bearings. They were farther from the cabin than he thought. At least 400 meters, perhaps more. And the storm was intensifying. "Listen to me," he said, pulling back to look at her face. "We'll follow the rope back to the cabin. Hold on to my coat, and don't let go, no matter what. Understand?" She nodded, her teeth chattering. Nelson rose and began retracing his path, feeling the rope with his hands. Nora clung to his coat, stumbling behind him. The wind battered them at every step, trying to shove them off course. Snow stung their exposed skin and seeped into every gap in their clothes. They'd covered half the distance when he felt Nora stumble. He caught her before she fell, but when he tried to help her up, she couldn't stand. "I can't," she whispered, her voice faint and broken. "I can't walk anymore." Nelson looked at the rope stretching into the white void, then at the child barely able to stay upright. He made his decision. Scooping her into his arms, he held her against his chest. "Then I'll carry you," he said simply. She was light, but in that storm, even her small weight made the journey harder. Nelson bowed his head against the wind and forced his legs forward. One step, then another, following the rope, trusting it completely. His arms ached, his legs burned, his lungs felt like ice inside. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The child in his arms needed him, and this time he wouldn't be too late. The rope grew shorter with each agonizing step. Safety drew nearer. Nelson felt his strength ebbing, the cold seeping deeper, but he pressed on. Through the storm, he saw a dark, solid shape, his cabin. "We're almost there," he whispered to Nora, who had gone eerily still in his arms. He kicked the door open and staggered inside, shouldering it shut against the howling wind. For a moment, he stood there, gasping, his body trembling from exertion and cold. But there was no time to rest. He carried Nora to the bed and laid her down gently. Her eyes were closed, her face as pale as the snow, her lips tinged blue. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, clear signs of hypothermia. "Nora," he urged. "Nora, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Cold," she whispered. "So cold." "I know. I'll warm you. Stay with me." His hands shook as he removed her wet coat, soaked gloves, and ice-caked scarf, the bright red scarf that had helped him find her. Everything was drenched, frozen, stealing the precious warmth from her small body. He gathered all the blankets in the cabin and wrapped them around her thickly. But they wouldn't be enough. Not when she was this cold. Nelson lit the fireplace, stacking log after log until the flames roared. Yet the cabin warmed too slowly. He needed to heat her faster. Making a quick decision, he stripped off his own wet clothes, climbed into bed beside her, and pulled her close, wrapping the blankets around them both. Body heat was the quickest way. "Stay with me," he murmured, rubbing her arms and back to create friction, warmth. "Don't you dare leave me. Not after all this. Not when I've finally learned to live again." Nora's violent shivers began to ease. Nelson kept talking to her, rubbing her limbs, sharing his warmth. "You'll be fine. You're strong and stubborn, and you never give up. You didn't give up on me when everyone else did, so you won't now." Minutes passed, 5, 10, 15, as the fire crackled and the storm raged outside. He held her tightly, feeling her gradually warm against him, her breaths deepening and steadying. "Mr. Nelson?" Her voice was weak but clearer. Relief washed over him so powerfully, he nearly wept. "I'm here. You're safe. I'm sorry. I got lost in the storm. I thought I was going the right way, but—" "Hush. It doesn't matter now. You're safe, that's all that matters." "You came for me," she said, her voice filled with awe. "In the storm, you came." "Of course I did. Did you think I wouldn't? I thought maybe I'd gone too far, that you wouldn't know I was lost." Nelson held her as she cried silent tears of relief. "I couldn't stay away. The moment I realized you might be out there, I had no choice. You're important to me, Nora. More than I knew how to say." "Like family?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Nelson thought of Catherine and Lily, the family he'd lost. Nora wasn't a replacement, but she was someone worth risking everything for. "Yes," he said, "like family." They lay there as the fire warmed the cabin, and Nora's tremors finally stopped. Color returned to her cheeks. The immediate danger had passed. A sudden knock at the door made them both jump. Nelson untangled himself and opened it to find Vernon Pritchard and Sheriff Raymond, both covered in snow and half frozen. Behind them, faint shapes in the storm, a search party. "Thank God," Vernon said, his voice shaking. Is she here? Is Nora here? She's here and she's all right. Come in quickly. The men stumbled inside and stood there, wet and shivering, staring at Nora wrapped in blankets by the fire, alive and clearly on the mend. We need to signal the others, Raymond said, blowing 3 sharp whistles. What happened? Vernon asked, moving closer to the fire. When Nora didn't come home, Pauline came looking for me. The whole town mobilized to search. Nelson explained how he'd sensed something was wrong, grabbed the rope and gone out. How he'd found her tracks leading the wrong way. How he'd carried her back and warmed her. Vernon listened, then placed a hand on Nelson's shoulder. You saved her life. If you hadn't gone out when you did. He left the thought unfinished. The door opened again, and Pauline rushed in, followed by several townsfolk. Her eyes locked on Nora, and the relief on her face was so profound it made her stagger. Nora, she whispered, hurrying to the bed. Nora, I'm fine, Aunt Pauline. Mr. Nelson saved me. Pauline pulled Nora into her arms, holding her tightly. When she finally looked at Nelson, her eyes were filled with tears. I don't know how to thank you. You risked your life in that storm for her. I couldn't do anything else, Nelson replied simply. Pauline stood there, holding Nora's hand and meeting his gaze. I was wrong about so many things. About you. About what Nora needs. About what true safety means. It's not just protecting someone from physical harm. It's making sure they have people who love them, who would walk into a storm for them. She wiped her eyes. You're that for her, you always have been. The cabin was now full, warm bodies crowding in, bringing a sense of community and connection. These people had braved the blizzard to search for a lost child, and they'd come to Nelson's cabin knowing he would help, trusting him. We should get her back to town, Raymond said. The storm's letting up. If we go now, we'll make it safely. I'll carry her, Vernon offered. But Nora shook her head. Mr. Nelson will carry me. He already did it once tonight. She looked at him with absolute trust. All right, Nelson said. Let's get you home. They wrapped Nora in dry blankets, and Nelson lifted her once more. The storm had begun to ease, the wind less fierce, the snow falling more gently. The search party formed around them, lanterns raised, as they processed through the white landscape toward town. As Nelson walked with Nora secure in his arms, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, he realized his fear that this crisis would destroy everything had been wrong. It had proven everything. It showed the town who he truly was. He was no longer the dangerous hermit. He was Nelson Rock, a part of this community, a friend to this child, someone worth searching for in a storm. He was finally home. Spring arrived in Pine Ridge slowly, reluctantly, as if winter clung to its grip. The snow melted into rushing streams, the pines shed their white burdens, and the days grew longer, warmer, full of promise. 3 months had passed since that stormy night, since Nelson had carried Nora through the blizzard, since the town had searched for her, since everything changed. Nelson stood outside his cabin on a mild April afternoon, watching Nora approach along the trail. She visited every day now, sometimes with her aunt's blessing, sometimes with Pauline herself. Pauline had softened in ways Nelson never thought possible. Mr. Nelson, she called, waving. In her hands she carried something wrapped in cloth. What's that you've got? He asked as she drew near. A surprise. Close your eyes. Nelson obliged. He heard a rustle, her excitement barely contained. Okay, open them. On the log they used as a work table sat a wooden carving, not one of his, but Nora's. The cuts were still learning, gaining confidence, but the theme was unmistakable. A bear and a small figure side by side, the bear's paw resting protectively on the figure's shoulder. It's us, Nora said, proud and a little shy. You and me. I worked on it for weeks. I wanted to capture what that night meant. Nelson picked up the sculpture carefully. The details were remarkable for someone so young. She'd given the bear his weathered features, and the small figure her red hair and determined stance. It's beautiful, he said, his voice husky. You've learned well. I had a good teacher, she smiled. It's for you to say thank you for everything. Nelson crouched to her level. You were the first to see me, remember? When everyone else was content to let me fade away. You looked beyond the stories and saw who I really was. So, we can thank each other. Nora threw her arms around his neck, and Nelson hugged her tightly. This child had saved him in ways she was too young to fully understand. When she pulled back, she was smiling through tears. Aunt Pauline says I can call you Uncle Nelson, if that's all right with you. The title settled on him like a warm, comfortable coat. I'd like that very much, he said. They spent the afternoon working with wood, talking, at ease in each other's company. Vernon stopped by with an invitation to the town's spring festival on Saturday. Nelson glanced at Nora, who nodded enthusiastically. We'll be there, he said. And he meant it. That night, after Nora had gone home, Nelson sat by the fire, reflecting on how far they had all come. The cabin felt different now, less a refuge and more a home. The shelf of carved animals had been rearranged to make room for Nora's pieces, and now the bear and the child stood side by side. He picked up his worn leather journal and turned to a blank page. My dearest Catherine, my sweet Lily. Today, Nora gave me a carving, a bear and a child together. She called it us. I never thought there would be an us for me again. But this child, she walked into my life and refused to let me hide. She saw something in me I had long forgotten, the capacity to care, to teach, to matter. I won't pretend the pain is gone. You are both with me every day. But the ache no longer defines me. I think you would have liked Nora. I think you would be happy that I've found my way back to the living. I will always love you, always carry you with me. But I am learning that loving you doesn't mean dying with you. It means living in a way that honors everything you taught me. Saturday arrived, bright and warm. Nelson put on his best clothes, trimming his beard with care. Nora met him at the edge of town, her red hair braided with ribbons, her face beaming. She took his hand without hesitation, and together they walked into the festival. People greeted him by name. With smiles, Vernon introduced him to newcomers. Mrs. Peterson insisted he try her pie. The blacksmith asked his opinion on a new forge design. A little boy stopped and looked up at Nelson, his eyes full of curiosity instead of fear. Are you the man who saved Nora in the storm? The boy asked. I am. That was brave. Sometimes, Nelson said, being brave just means caring enough to try. As the afternoon wore on, with music playing and people dancing, Nelson found himself not on the fringes, but in the very heart of it all. And when Nora pulled him into a clumsy dance, her feet on top of his so he could guide her through the steps, he felt Catherine and Lily with him, not as ghosts, not as grief, but as a blessing. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, a tired and happy Nora leaned against his side. This was the best day, she told him. It was a good day, Nelson agreed. Uncle Nelson, are you happy? He looked around, at the town that had once shunned him and then embraced him, at the people who had become his family, at this child who refused to accept anything less than his whole heart. Yes, he said, and realized it was the truth. Yes, Nora, I'm happy. The loneliest people are the ones everyone has decided are not worth knowing until someone decides otherwise. Nora had decided otherwise. She had looked past the stories, past the fear, past 12 years of isolation, and saw a man worth knowing. And in doing so, she gave him the greatest gift of all, the chance to begin again, the courage to open his heart, the hope that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. They walked home through the spring night, uncle and niece in everything but blood. And in Nelson's cabin, the wooden carving of the bear and the child was waiting, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of faith can change everything. For 12 years, Nelson Rock had been lost, but now he was found, and that had made all the difference.